occupy one of the front seats. So welcome everyone. And let's get this thing rolling.
I got to take image
well
over
done.
here.
Okay, so I'm Nigel Kane, and this is Damien Flynn, and you may recognize us from our blog series on virtual networking, of which we'll talk about a little bit more. But today we're going to be talking about Damien's experience as an early adopter of System Center and Hyper-V 2012.
Okay, so we've got a few things to cover in the session this morning, but one thing that we do want is to encourage you guys to ask questions. This is really about trying to leverage information from the experiences we've had with System Center, the challenges and the good stuff, because it's been a little bit of both, of course. We've got a few different issues or topics that we want to cover. So,
yeah, one of the key points, basically, this is not your normal kind of view of a TAP presentation, if you will. What we're looking to do is actually, as Damien referenced, actually call out some of the key learning points that you can take back to your offices and use in your environment. So our goal at the end of this presentation is there's a couple of aha moments where you go, yep, that's the sort of thing we want to be able to apply in our environment. That's our measure of success, so hopefully you'll let us know one way or the other whether we made that.
Okay, good enough. So I suppose the first things we need to do is actually sort out some formal introductions of who's who and what's what. Nigel Kane, of course, to my side. We were thinking of playing the Muppet Show theme soon this morning, but I was afraid you might actually think I was the Muppet. So Nigel's from Microsoft. He's our Senior Project Manager in charge of... what are you in charge of, Nigel,
well, I led the System Center 2012 SP1 Technology Adoption Program.
That's correct. So I worked closely with Nigel over the last year and a half. But he's started to reject the love, and he's moved over to the hosters guys now to support those. So myself, I'm a core infrastructure architect for a company called Lionbridge Technologies, and I'm an MVP with Microsoft on the cloud and data center services side of the world. Together, Nigel and I have been working quite close. We've published on the Microsoft System Center blogs a series of postings on Virtual Machine Manager and how we deal with the new networking infrastructure that's sitting within Virtual Machine Manager itself. And also, I've been a co-author of 2 different books on cloud technologies. The first of those is Microsoft Private Cloud Computing, and the second one that's just been released is the Hyper-V Configuring Bible. So over the course of this presentation, I've got a few of those that we need to get rid of, because carrying them back is just not going to happen.
So enough sales talk, Damien. Let's get on to the presentation.
Right, okay, so I suppose the first thing I got to do is just talk about where my environment comes from and what we do. I work for a company called Lionbridge Technologies. I'm sure everyone in the audience has heard of who Lionbridge is, but just to recap, we are an organization that spans the globe, and our task effectively is to translate words. Our job essentially is to take in a product, a book, a piece of software, or anything that's in a language, and essentially convert it to a different language. So we would work with people like Microsoft and convert things like Windows 8 into, I believe, 49 different languages. We also do a lot of other type stuff. If you've ever bought a piece of software with a sticker on the front end, it's got the Windows logo on it to say that your software runs on Windows. We've certified it. It comes to our labs and we do all the stress tests to make sure it gets that logo. In addition, we also work with what we call search optimization. So essentially, when you log into Bing and you search for a particular topic, depending on where you are on the planet, that topic is going to have particular relevance. It's our job to make sure that the relevance that you see effectively gets scored correctly. So when you're in China and search for a particular word, it's going to show the relevant content around that. So essentially there's a whole lot of stuff going on here, and as we take a look through the rest of this presentation, we're going to focus essentially on 2 areas of this. We're going to talk a little bit about the test side of the world and the translation side of the world, where we focus on what it means to take in customer stuff and use something like System Center to help us make sure that we can keep our customers happy and essentially translate this stuff for them, test it and make sure that when they run it back out, that stuff does what they need, but at the same time, their information is kept private throughout that whole cycle.
So, Damien, when you started this project, what was top of mind for your CIO, and what did the business expect from IT generally?
Well, that's a kind of an interesting question, to be honest. And I suppose the easiest way to start that one is to think a little bit about how we manage IT and run a strategy in Lionbridge. on what would probably appear as a yearly basis, our senior management sit down and take a look at some of the objectives that we need to achieve through the IT infrastructure and through the systems that are in IT. And those are pretty wide, broad objectives. Those then work through the IT process and the chain of command effectively figure out what it is that we can do to help deliver on some of those services. I get involved into that process as we start looking a little bit more about the actual physical architecture and how we deliver those. Figure out where the system center fit into that and how our infrastructure needs to be manipulated and morphed to address some of these different types of technologies. So over the course of that year, we'll start off with quite a number of different objectives that will need to be hit, and we'll fine-tune those to figure out how we're going to deliver those through the infrastructure and through things like System Center. So that's kind of probably the easiest way to crack open the head and figure out what's going on.
So Damien, why TAP?
Well, some of the things that we're doing is pretty new, and we're taking in technologies that have the requirements to be localized. So as I said, we translate something like Windows 8 in 49 languages. That means a whole lot of people, and as a result of that, we're not going to stuff everybody into little offices around the planet, so we need to actually figure out, can we make them work from home, and can we do all other types of smart things to keep our costs down, keep productivity high, and get good resource utilization. TAP allows us to actually take a look at the technologies that we have, specifically from Microsoft, and say, this doesn't work. But more importantly, I can turn around to somebody like Nigel, who would be my TAP contact, and tell him why it doesn't work, explain the scenario, and then encourage him nicely to change the product to make sure it does work. I think that puts us...
So let's take a little deeper look into what you actually did during the course of the year.
Right, okay. So I think the best thing to do here is we're going to split this into maybe 2 or 3 different areas. And the first one is effectively reweaving that fabric. We want to go through and talk about some of the things that had to be done within our existing environment, because we're not a greenfield, we're not brand new. So we've got infrastructure out there that we have to think about and figure out what changes. We've got clouding services that we've been doing for probably 5 years, 6 years at this point, and things change, technologies update, so again we've got to go back and figure out what have we done good, what have we done bad, and how are we going to optimize that to make it better. And then finally, what is involved in delivering this service back to our organization.
Damien, I like the phrase reweaving the fabric. Can you give us a little bit of insight in what you mean by that?
Okay, so as the colour shows really on the deck, we are not a green field. We have a fabric, we have lots of infrastructure sitting in that environment, and within that environment we need to actually envision new ways to actually figure out how are we going to successfully change and architect the foundation that we have in that data center. So effectively that fabric that exists today has to be morphed, it has to be rewoven into a new methodology so that it's going to work with technologies like converged networking, and take a look at some of the actual infrastructure sitting there and figure out what needs to move in and what needs to move out. Getting everything effectively into the System Center 2012 way of thinking.
Okay. So let's take a closer look at that fabric and how you changed it in the course of that year.
Right, okay. So that's not really a trivial question, as anybody out here will recognize. Changing what you have, which is running a live business, has to be done very carefully. And when you've got a lot of customers and a lot of business people utilizing this stuff, making those changes has to be done in a very controlled approach. To do that, we've broken it into kind of 4 major areas. We want to extract what exactly is sitting in that physical fabric. When we've dealt with that, we need to think about the fact that we've got heterogeneity in the environment. We've got more than Microsoft sitting in our world. We need to control how we access that as a system, and that's both from the actual infrastructure teams and, of course, our end users, and more importantly, our vendors and our contractors that are coming in through the environment. And finally, how we control. What do we do with what we have in that resource to make sure that we stay as a maintainable operation?
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your physical environment?
Yeah, let's do that. So our physical environment is based in the US. So as a global organization, our data centers as such are both based in the West Coast, in the Boston area. And effectively what we've got is 2 pretty large data centers, and the theory behind them is to have one primary, that's where all of our running stuff is happening, and the second one then is basically a hot standby or a disaster recovery site. So within the environment we've got a number of different infrastructure pieces of technology to help us do things like BGP and making sure that we can take product that's running in one data center, and if necessary, take that single solution or multiple solutions and pull them over to the far side of the world. And that's effectively the starting point that we need to take a look at when we actually get into the point of delivering some of those services that are sitting in the Windows 2012 world. And from our field offices, they're all coming back in with what we call a DMVPN. And effectively that is it's a multi-point mesh so that any one office can talk to each other or talk to the data center without having to route their traffic straight through the data center. So we try and keep everything as fast as possible right around the world. And that even includes our teleworkers who essentially were going to come directly into the data center across RDP or whatever the technologies are that we're using.
Okay, so let's take a look at the network component of this.
Okay, so
which is our favorite bit, obviously.
this is the one that certainly takes up all of our time. Networking is a nightmare, and as IT professionals, we have to respect the fact that the network guys don't like to be told that they're making a mess of things. But we have to deliver a service on top of that. And when we start thinking about Virtual Machine Manager, we know how easy that is to do. It's just really easy, go in, point, click, and everything works, right? No, not really. Seriously, it's not that easy. We've got to basically figure out how are we going to explain to these guys what we need. And what we need is pretty complicated at times because we have a requirement for obviously our internal users. They generally come first. We've got a requirement for our teleworkers, our vendors and our contractors. They've got to be able to get into our environment. We have to acknowledge the fact that we're going to have customers sitting in that network that have to be completely isolated, and we've got all of these different regulations that come into play. And finally, we've got to actually think about the physical infrastructure that we build on top of, that storage networks, the live migrations, and everything else that's contained within those environments. And then we want to make things better. We've got to think about the scenarios of what switchgear is sitting in there. We want to think about how do we organize our VLANs and turn on things like 10 gig Ethernet and so on and so forth. So from that perspective, we've got a whole lot of work to do in essentially taking that information and translating it to something that we can process and we can communicate in two directions, one down to the network and two back up to our fabric administrators.
So Damien, this is all kind of interesting stuff, but how does this translate back into System Center and Virtual Machine Manager?
Okay, so the drawing here becomes my Bible. This is my reference that I basically just print out, and as you can see, it's very, very granular. I'm using color more than I'm using anything else. So when I'm sitting in front of that network engineer, I send him out this copy, and I basically say, take a look at that, and over on the lower right-hand side, I've got my three little networks. That's my storage, it's my clustering, it's live migration. Now tell me what you think in the network you're physically using for VLANs or what networks I need to plug into. And it's that level of communication we use. Once I've figured out what he's doing on the physical, I've kind of got my color codes that helps me to put the comments in to understand what are the information I'm going to be actually putting into things like Virtual Machine Manager when I go in there and actually start defining the network. So I have a map, I have a clear, easy to read map that tells me how to do that translation. Now, if I switch up to the middle part of the environment, I've got my management infrastructure, and that is my VMMs, my Windows servers, my Active Directory, my portals. They're all connecting back essentially to the heart of the network, the core network, my yellow network, and that comes back down into the hypervisors. So we're giving that normal IT environment that allows us to actually figure out what communicates with what. We've got our administrators coming directly into those servers, and we may have firewalls and stuff where our external users are coming in. If we want to turn on technologies in the future like network virtualization gateways and stuff like that, those we pop in here as well and make sure that they're connected to that managed network so we can have things like VMM communicate with them. But the heart of the essence is really sitting over on the lower left-hand side. Every single color essentially representing a new tenant VLAN, an area where we put our new customers in. Every one of them is separate, every one of them is isolated. So you can essentially show that each person is getting a separate network, and when we sit then with the actual network guys and explain what we're trying to do, they can address their network routing and anything else they may be doing if they're stretching or routing or stuff like that. And we can take that again, that information for, I've brought in a new tenant and he's going to be tenant green. What is the technical information you're telling me? VLANs, or you give me IP ranges and stuff like that. And that's enough for me then to define essentially sites when I go back into the VMM world to take a look at.
So Damien, it sounds like you're a, excuse me, it sounds like you're a hoster or you're doing hosting services.
We are, and we're not. It's taking that mind map and effectively figuring out what are we delivering. We've got our normal enterprise to deliver to, which obviously runs our Exchange, our Active Directory, and all of those lovely things. We have our DevOps teams who are coming in doing their normal works, going through the different staging cycles and getting us out to production. So we run the normal world. But on the other side, then we've got all of that stuff that's coming in from our customers. That is definitely hosters, because there we've got to follow everything that would normally be the rule of thumb for a hoster. It has to be isolated, it has to be easily accessible, it has to be elastic, and it needs to be in a scenario that makes it easy for us to actually deliver on. So yeah and no.
So can you give us an idea of who your customers are?
Yeah, we've got a fair few customers in the environment, but I think what I'll do for a second is just take that mind map that we've done and just show you what's happened when we've gone from 2012 over to the SP1 world. We started off essentially as anybody that's already pushed out 2008 or even 2012 version of VMM, every single one of those customer networks, and even my live migration and stuff, they end up being defined essentially as a logical network. And if you've done this, as you add more, VMM and all of the Hyper-V hosts that it speaks to kind of get a little bit slower and slower and slower and slower. To the point that it becomes a little bit unusable and extremely unmanageable. In the 2012 world, that mind map that we looked at a few moments ago becomes an awful lot easier to implement, because now we just create one single logical network and we simply call it, this is my isolated VLAN or my tenant VLAN or whatever the case may be. And then as we add each of these new tenant VLANs, those little green, reds and stuff that we've seen in the lower left-hand side of that mind map, we simply take those and we actually put them into the logical network definition as new sites. Now, I've stolen a screenshot from our blog series, specifically because obviously I don't want to go through the name of every single project. So in the real environment, every one of those logical networks happens to be code names, so we might see words like and colors that we don't want to talk about, showing down through that list. So for every customer, there's going to be an extra site, and that simply makes it much easier for us to deal with the fact of how VMM is now going to make life easy to deliver those services. So again, architecting from 2008/2012 into the SP1 world from the mind map and taking a look at the screenshots here, it becomes an awful lot easier.
So what you're saying basically, you've gone from what was a lot of logical networks to a single logical network with multiple network sites.
Absolutely. And then when you take a look at all of the customers, which you referred to immediately at the start of this one, there's a whole lot of them. And you can see names up there who really do not want their information to be shared with anybody else in the environment. So certainly from a hoster's perspective and how we deliver that stuff in VMM, this stuff needs to work. And essentially, it does work. I believe we've got a 70% return rate on our customers, so these guys are pretty happy that VMM is able to deliver a secure environment.
Okay.
Okay, so the other side of that fabric is a little bit of thinking about what's involved in actually re-architecting. As I started, we're not a greenfield site, so with this stuff in the background, I've used the color green because it's not new, it's actually existing. And we've got servers that are running 2012 as part of TAP. We've got other servers that are part of the infrastructure that are still running good old 2008. Those have been split off into different areas of focus, delivering on things like production, QA, and of course allowing us to deliver that cloud services essentially for each of our tenants that we just looked at. That stuff needs to be morphed. It needs to be changed into a whole new methodology of actually simplifying things and making things easier for us to work with as we move forward.
So it sounds like in the kind of pre-2012 world, each department had their own server and kind of their own were responsible for their own fabric.
Yeah, a little bit. Like if you think of how things move across in time, originally when a project would come in, it would go to a particular location, somebody has won it, and as a result then they will go ahead, they will purchase the hardware that's required or lease it for the period of time that they need to actually run their particular projects. It's all sitting under their desks, and you as an IT guy have to deal with all of that things. Then we kind of got a little bit smarter and we figured out that we'll buy that stuff for them centrally and we'll put it into our data center, put the cloud infrastructure in front of it, and effectively give them back the amount of resources they just paid for. Mm-hmm. As we move forward in time, we need to start evolving on that thing. So in the old model, as they got to a point that their project was finished, they would ring the guy they leased from, put it back in a truck and ship off all the stuff. In our current environment, we've got to a point that when your project is done, I take that resources because I bought the hardware and I'll pool it up ready for the next set of projects that comes in. So I now get a better return on investment straight away.
Okay.
So if we take that a step further then, with that theory of pooling, and you're dedicating that resource originally up front, we can go through and we can make those pools a little bit larger. And we can stop building the pools based specifically on what those users are using, but rather than the resources that we have. And over time, as we started putting more and more infrastructure in there, we have stuff that's sitting for 4 and 5 years, and then you've got stuff that's coming in new. And you're building kind of new clusters, because we've been at that scenario of you want to make sure host processor compatibility is the same throughout the stacks. And as time goes on, these things get smaller and more powerful. And we are now looking at that process of going ahead to build much more resilient, smaller, or should I say larger stacks of compute power, and then basically putting a label saying that new stuff that we've just brought in is really fast, so we'll give that the gold label and we can use that thing for production. The stuff that's last generation is still really good, but we'll take that and we'll put that and maybe call that the silver and use that for the little bit less critical workloads that need that performance levels. And then we'll segregate out the management of this stuff. So previously we would have distributed a lot of our management stack across the rest of that infrastructure, and if things went wrong, we might lose some of our management, which is always not a good thing. So start learning from some of those different types of implementation decisions that would have been originally made. And then the far side of that, then you've got all that older hardware, which is effectively taking up space and power that generally one new box is probably capable of doing. So you end up with a lot of stuff that's being cleaned out and simplifying your environment. All of this happening while you're running process. Everything is happening live in an environment.
Okay. One of the things it looks like you've done there is you've moved, or you've enabled people to move from wanting hardware to actually just being able to consume virtual machines and services. Was that difficult?
It was and it wasn't, depending on how we approach this thing. Most of the users and project managers essentially got to the point that it was easier for us to buy stuff centrally. We could manage and we could do a lot of services. So IT as a service started to become an intricate value here, because essentially as they brought in infrastructure, they had to get somebody to actually unbox it, plug it in, and do all the wiring. And they would have lots of resources. When we centralized that, we could cut down on the amount of hardware that was required essentially to do so, and we could take the workload ourselves back into the data center, put a web page in front of it, and they were up and running much faster. And then as time has progressed forward, we've been able to start morphing what's happening in the background behind that cloud page, and effectively start delivering a bigger service. So initially, the first reaction was, I don't see it under my desk, but once they realized it still can have all the resources but faster, and then as time is going on, these resources get faster and faster, it becomes less of a challenge, to be honest.
So we talked about compute. Let's kind of look at storage, which is one of the other key factors.
Well, this one is really interesting, because storage is something that we can certainly see in 2012 in the Windows world. Microsoft has certainly begun embracing a lot tighter with the idea of introductions for storage spaces and stuff. We are essentially talking about putting commodity disk behind the environment. So effectively delivering that back out as far as our users with a thin, simplified methodology for delivering services. This is something that we've actually been doing for a lot of years, but not using, obviously, Microsoft technologies. A third-party piece of software called InStore, which effectively is communicating with all of our disk vendors. So we go out as far as people like LSI, Hitachi, EMC, and we buy the disk. We don't bother worrying about the fact that I need snapshot licenses, I need licenses for doing replication and all that carry on. It's irrelevant. I just want a good SAN, a good controller, and a pile of disk on it. And that basically just then registers back up as a block of storage that effectively we then strip and do all of the magic on within the actual Falcon Store appliance. And once that's stripped and thin provisioned and a whole lot, we present that back up as far as our hosts. Now, that probably 2 years ago would have sounded like, are you mad? But now when we take a look at what's going on with Windows Server 2012, it's effectively exactly the same thing that we're doing in storage spaces, except the presentation in that case is going to be SMB3 rather than iSCSI.
So you mentioned SMB3. Looking at the diagram and some of the things that we've talked about in the past, it doesn't look like you're using it at the moment.
Not yet. We are still targeting iSCSI with 10 gig configurations in the environment at the moment, simply because effectively Microsoft's solution doesn't yet talk to the SAN. So I still need the NSS solutions to do that. But on the other side of it, the NSS solutions don't offer me SMB3. So I still have to use iSCSI. So I'm a little bit cornered here. But what I am looking at is that the point in time is going to come where I can effectively probably put a Windows server sitting in there beside those Falcon Store devices, and effectively have some disk coming from that EMC up to the Windows server and delivering that out as far as SMB3. And over a period of time, I will get to a day when I can turn off the Falcon Store boxes and move completely over to SMB3.
Does your storage run, we talked about converged networks, then we just touched on it briefly. Does your storage use the same network as everything else, or are you split that apart?
All right, you're asking hard questions, and it's 8:30 in the morning, Nigel. Basically, yeah and no. In this particular case, we have the theory is converged networks, essentially. We're talking about what do we do with our data network that's going back as far as the storage from our Hyper-V clusters and all stuff like that. We've left it isolated, to be completely honest. We have gone back and revigorated the environment by putting in 10 gig Ethernet to these things and giving it a whole load of extra capacity. But in all due respects to my fellow network engineers, too much changes gets things complicated, and when we make things complicated, it makes everybody's life miserable. So one step at a time is kind of where we're coming from here. We do plan to converge, and we will converge, but we're going to do that a little bit later once these guys actually figure out what that means. These concepts are getting more complicated as we start introducing things like PVLANs, VLANs, and now we're putting in converged networks, and it's too much to consume at one single point in time. So today, the answer is no. We are running this thing with the same infrastructure. It's connecting to the same switches, but it is in dedicated network, so not essentially converged. But the fabric is in place. It makes it easy for us to do that. So we might wait and deliver that as we get towards that SMB3 utopia.
Can you give us a little bit more insight into your storage model?
Well, this one I think gets derived really by Microsoft. Anybody that's pushed out a Hyper-V world has probably delivered a CSV cluster, and essentially the rule of thumb on that one was that for every node in the cluster you introduce a CSV. The screenshot says it all. It becomes a little bit complicated. And then when we start looking at the utilization on the disks and we start doing things like VMM for placement, it gets a little bit messy pretty quickly, trying to figure out who's going where and what disks are full and managing all of this type stuff. With the integration of Windows Server 2012, I can smile. I get one disk per cluster. I don't have to worry about a lot of this problems that we had in CSV 1.0. In the 2.0 environment, I can have one pretty large disk, and I can expand it as well, and I can make it very easy to figure out, do I have storage space available? Rather than checking 8, 10, 12 different CSVs, I check one, I expand it, and move on. So certainly taking advantage of those technologies is certainly going to make our life easier. And when we move forward in SMB3, that stuff even gets simpler because we just make a point to a share on a file server and manage it from that perspective. So I don't even have to worry about expanding disks in this methodology.
Well, we discussed a little while ago before we got to this session about how you'd structure the disks for your virtual machines. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, okay. So one of the things that we have, we looked at the very start of that our infrastructure was 2 data centers. The whole idea of high availability / disaster recovery. And like all good organizations, we made a decision how we're going to do that. And our decision was the intelligent decision to do stretched VLANs. So essentially we had the same IP range sitting in the second data center. If anybody's ever done that, it's a pain in the ass. If you haven't done it, don't. That's probably one single takeaway. It's not fun. Think about your Active Directory and you're trying to define an Active Directory site. You're trying to get an Exchange server to go and talk to a domain controller in that site. It ain't going to work. Then you go and start thinking about your virtual machines, and this is going to be great, lads, because I can actually take a VM and I can move it across the WAN. It doesn't work. We did do some things intelligent, though, or at least I'd like to think they were intelligent. We split the operating system on our VMs so that essentially there was 2 disks for every operating system, the OS itself and the page file. So using that replication technology that we had, we basically went to that fact that we had hundreds of CSVs, and one CSV we put the operating system on the second CSV we put the page file on. Like all good things, we manage it well, and when you come back and check a few weeks later, there's page file stuck in the middle of the operating system. Well, we won't talk about that because we're good people. Instead, we'll think about why did we do that, and the reason why is very simple. I want to actually replicate only the operating system over to the far data center. Because there's no point bringing over a page file, simply because when I fail over to the far data center, I've got to do a power on and start up anyways. I can't do things like live migration across there. So when I die in the first data center, there's no point in me taking that page file, which is constantly changing and sending data across the WAN. So we split those things across. And that's the practice we've continued to do even as we moved into Windows 2012. But 2012 has made life an awful lot easier. With the second data center, we essentially now have the poor network guys scratching their heads very hard, trying to figure out how the hell to get rid of the stretched VLANs and get me back into a routed network. And that challenge is their problem. But what they're trying to figure out right now is to get that routing working so that I can come back and start turning on really cool features that are sitting in Hyper-V. Because Hyper-V now does that replica to another server over on the far side. But the problem we've had up till now was, well, if it's on a different IP range, what the hell am I going to do when I power it on? Because it's not going to be a ping router or do anything like that. So as the screenshot is showing, you can. As you power on the machine on the far side, it'll inject a new IP address. So effectively, that node that's sitting in data center 1 with IP address A, when it comes up on the far side, has IP address B. And effectively, we now have dealt with that challenge that we were dealing with of bringing up disaster recovery far simpler. And it also means that even if we do mess up and kind of put the page files onto the wrong CSV, and in 2012 we've only got one CSV, Hyper-V Replica is dealing with just the disk that we need to replicate and leave the other disk behind.
So Damien, doesn't network virtualization address a lot of this?
No. Network virtualization doesn't really address those for us. Network virtualization is one of those things that sounds great on paper and it's really cool for the marketing guys, but when you try and deliver that as an actual service, that's when you start really realizing that this thing is a little bit harder. Network virtualization's theory is that we can forget about the fact that what IP ranges are sitting in there, but it's a bit of a challenge when we try to actually get from that virtual world to the physical world. So if we take a look at maybe the network virtualization that exists today with NVGRE, Microsoft's network virtualization solution, it works really well in an environment which needs to be isolated. So as I went back to my tenants idea there earlier on with all my different customers, that's pretty cool. Network virtualization works great, as long as I don't need to get in or get out of that virtual world, because essentially we're trying to get our hands on a gateway. Now, yesterday evening, Greg Kazan's actually done 2 presentations here at MMS talking about network virtualization and the gateways, and I think he demonstrated the first of the gateway modules that Microsoft is going to present. And I believe out in the expo hall we've got a company called IR Networks that are also demonstrating this stuff, which is a hardware appliance to do it. But we aren't there yet. And in any case, with network virtualization, it still doesn't address the fact that when I bring up a VM, I may need to change that IP address, and when I'm replicating it, I may need to think about what's happening on the far side. So, yeah, network virtualization will make our life easier, but we're just not ready.
Okay. So let's continue looking at your private cloud.
Okay, so I suppose the next one in that whole idea is that now that we've dealt with the actual abstraction layer, we've got the heterogeneity stuff. That isn't as important. We're running essentially our environment with a mix of Linux and Windows in the environment. But of that, the important piece is that our hosting services that run this stuff is really Windows 2012. So heterogeneity is really not that important to us as we move forward.
But are you going to be managing Linux or Unix VMs?
Absolutely. But those are VMs that are supported within the actual VM environment, but it don't add any extra complexity effectively to how we actually manage the physical environments. Hyper-V is our virtualization platform, so heterogeneity is really not a problem. So when I think a little bit about what we've just done here, we've built up a data center, essentially done a number of morphing technologies to figure out how we fix the network. We've got the network guys to get us a 10 gig environment. We've gone through our Hyper-V hosts and started consolidating those into new stacks. It's kind of interesting to think about the fact that we've got 2 of these data centers sitting in the West Coast, but the team that are responsible for managing that cloud, they're actually distributed, as you can see in the map, a little bit all over the planet. And the guy that's actually ultimately responsible for our cloud happens to be the furthest guy away, sitting in Tokyo. So access to this environment is very much cloud as well. So not only are our users cloud users, but our administrators essentially are utilizing that cloud type technologies. And for all of the users and customers that are involved in this thing, there's simply 2 guys on the ground taking care of that data center. So racking, stacking, plugging it in, and walking away, making life very, very easy for actually managing how this stuff works.
You said you got 2 data centers on the East Coast. Are they active, or is one DR?
One is essentially DR, and we kind of looked at that a little bit in that last slides where we started talking about the fact of taking Hyper-V replica and bringing the information over. There is some stuff that would be active-active. If I think of things like Exchange, they're always running, they're always replicating. SQL always on is always on and running. But essentially, we don't particularly want to go live in the second data center if we don't have to. And we think about that from the perspective of if our service is running in a primary data center and a second service is in the second data center, normally it may need to make a reference across. So if it's easier, then we're going to keep it in that primary data center, but we're set it up so that we can take a specific load and actually separate them.
Okay, let's look at the data center for a minute. What hardware have you got in the data center? Have you got clusters in there?
Yeah, essentially a little bit like what we looked at in the slides a little bit back. The environment essentially is built from stacks of servers, very simply standardized hardware. We've gone through that whole idea of trying to build the stacks as large as we can, keep the hardware exactly the same, and then allow us to do things like over provisioning and giving us N+1 type resilience, so that effectively we've one extra node who's sitting there hot idle in those stacks as we move forward to build through.
Okay, so we've talked about hosts, on networking, storage, user roles. Tell us a little bit about the cloud infrastructure you set up.
Right, okay. So it becomes easy to start figuring out where we're moving from here. Everything that we've seen so far is allowing us to make those non-greenfield changes and bring them back as far as VMM, because essentially that is the front door for everything that is cloud. So like most other operations, we've broken those things into two sets of groups. Obviously the host group itself, which is taking those clusters of actual server loads and allowing us then to take a very simple methodology for assigning things like optimizations and networking across that particular cloud. But far more on the opposite side of that, we actually have the clouds themselves for each of the different tenants. Now in the snapshot, I've just picked a random set of cloud names that mean absolutely nothing specifically for anybody. There were just a set of random things that we've put in there. But in a real world scenario, those are effectively the names of our tenants or the name of the particular project that we're running for our tenants. And that's the extraction essentially that we're delivering back to those users. And as those users come to us and tell us that we have a new requirement for a cloud, we basically will just go ahead, provision that name, and start off figuring out what sort of resources they need to put in behind that.
Do you look at or are you using any form of chargeback or showback monitoring so that people can see exactly what they're consuming?
I'll be honest, and we're not. This is certainly one of those areas where we are not where we need to be. We have a process that helps us as administrators to keep an eye on what's happening in the resources and figure out the requests that are coming into our users. But we're not essentially telling the users that you are consuming X, Y, and Z worth of resources and as a result has a financial implication. That's certainly going to change. And as we move forward with Windows 2012 and Service Pack 1 for System Center and introductions to what's coming with Service Manager, these guys can look forward to the fact of actually starting to figure out what those resources are. Now, if we physically charge them, that may or may not be the case. That'll be a business decision, but we certainly will let them know what it is they're going to be utilizing in that environment.
It's interesting, that kind of approach, though, but how do you take that and say, okay, I'm going to justify the acquisition of new servers?
Yeah, well, this one kind of goes back to where we've come from originally, and it was probably also the roadmap to help us getting into the cloud in the first place. They have to buy servers in order to run business. It's as simple as. So as a customer product comes in, so let's go back to Windows 8, for example, and Microsoft knock on the door and say, we need 49 languages localized. That immediately means, oh, crap, I need hardware. And in the old world, that meant that 49 locations around the world will all come back to the COO and the finance guys and says, we need to buy X number of servers, so there's going to have to be a pot and a budget in order to do that project. Now in the new world, essentially the fact that these guys need that stuff, we basically take in all of the numbers for their forecast and say, right, instead of buying X hundred number of servers, I'm going to buy 3 or 4 or 5 large scale servers and put them into data center and whap the cloud in front of the thing. I'll take that budget, thank you very much, and I'll buy those things and I'll manage it. And it's cheaper essentially for us to go buy that thing than it would have been to go and lease the hardware in those other 40 locations. So for the benefit now becomes really easy. Because we didn't have to lease, it means at the end of that project, that hardware is still sitting there. Now we have a fabric that started to grow and we can start extending on it. And yeah, it may sit there for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, but as we looked at there a little bit earlier in the deck where we talked about the fact that we've got servers that are now ready to be moved out, we can essentially decommission them because they have well and truly done their work. And it becomes easy for us to justify that with finance as well because essentially they would have been putting them back at the end of the lease anyways. Now we've got 2 and 3 project extras out of it.
Okay, so let's look at the kind of resources. Interesting numbers you came up with in terms of the number of administrators, the number of people running this.
This is all about learning from your mistakes. Fortunately, we made a few mistakes through the process. So we were one of the very first early adopters of cloud, and I'm going to use that as my excuse here. Please don't shoot me, and I'll give away a free book to anybody that accepts that apology. Basically, what we've ended up in the scenario with is we've got somewhere in the region of 450 templates in our VMM library, which is just crazy. But what's worse is if I take a look at the amount of physical objects or physical resources sitting in that library, there's actually more. There's 503, and this is just one snap of one part of the environment. If I showed you the true numbers, then I might be a little bit embarrassed to sit up here, so we're not just going to do that. Now the question really is, what the hell were you doing when you done that, and why? We've come to a scenario here where we've had essentially a lot of challenges, and I'm blaming Microsoft, so sorry Nigel, but this is your fault.
Me personally, David.
Absolutely. You're Mr. Tap, so therefore you have to take the responsibility for now fixing this stuff. If you've ever done VMM prior to 2012 SP1, one of the things you learn pretty quickly is that these templates aren't just as portable as everybody likes to think they are. So as we introduce new clouds, you might take an existing template and try and associate it with the cloud to find the damn network doesn't work. So it's kind of important that the templates are all in separate networks so that I can keep all of those customers happily and isolated. So it becomes an absolute requirement in those versions of VMM prior to 2012 SP1 that you actually go and create a new template every time you make a new cloud so you can associate it and make sure it's isolated. Now, thankfully, as we move forward into the SP1 world, we now have the network portability in the VM templates. At the 2012 RTM stuff, they did fix this stuff, but only if you were using Surface templates, which really doesn't help when you're just delivering virtual machines out on an IaaS type solution. So SP1 has finally got me to a point that in our new environments, which I'm not showing here, we've actually been able to drop that template count down to, I think it's 11 templates, which is an absolute massive saving on stuff. And as a result of the physical object library, we can filter through it, start using MUI packs and stuff, and again, dump half that crap that we don't need anymore. And that really means that VMM runs faster, is easier to manage.
So before we move on to the next topic, let's pause for a moment to reflect on some of the findings that you had from building out that fabric. So what are the key things that you would say to everyone, look, you need to think about these things as you move into fabric design?
Okay, so a quick recap on the slides. In the network, think about your mind map. That mind map might look kind of stupid enough when you take a look at it originally, but it becomes a really easy tool to help you bridge from the network guys to the VMM world. And we all know how easy the VMM world is, never mind the network guys. So mind map is actually quite important, and colors are easy to communicate. So draw and start with that, and then start mapping your physical network into that mind map so that you can build your logical networks as you move forward. The other thing that we will probably do is figure out, when you've got that mind map, what networks are good for convergence. You don't have to do them all today. We've highlighted that when I haven't actually highlighted my storage networks. You can prepare yourself for those things and do them in steps. Don't overwhelm the changes that you're about to do. So identify them and plan them through that map and make things easier as you move forward. You can use VMM essentially for creating the hosts. So one of the things you'll have to be very, very careful about when you move into the 2012 SP1 world is that we have these concepts of logical switches, virtual switches, and all sorts of damn switches. Don't be caught out by actually installing your Hyper-V servers, building the cluster, converging your network with PowerShell, sitting back and saying, thank God that job is done, that was great. Because the second you push out VMM, he's just going to say, oh, I see the network, yeah, so what? It's ugly. I can't manage that, thank you very much. And he won't manage it. So it means if you want to turn on things like network virtualization and all those fancy features, you can't. It's not happening. Port profiles, all of those things, they're generally not available. So you have to sit back and think about VMM a little bit earlier in that process and allow VMM to go ahead and build that network stack for you. So allow it to build that virtual switch that's sitting on your hosts. And then you start figuring out that that's called a logical switch. And what a logical switch essentially is a distributed switch. It's across all of those hosts and to make sure everything looks the same. It's a concept that's pretty confusing. But it's a concept that you have to be very aware of, otherwise you will invest a pile of time and figure out that, oh crap, I got to do it again. And of course, it's not the same as how you were doing it when you were doing it in Hyper-V, because the command sets are slightly different. The other piece, just to jump through that one, is KISS, KISS. Keep it simple. It's as simple as that. The simpler you keep it for everyone, from your cloud administrators to yourself as the Fabric administrator and to the network guys, then the easier this is going to be. Keep the template counts down, keep the networks down, keep everything simple. Use those color charts. You will win that way. And take things in small steps. Be careful about what you're doing. Figure out that you do want to do converged networks, but don't do it today. Do it tomorrow.
So you built the Cloud Fabric or re-engineered the Cloud Fabric. Let's look at optimizing. So what did you do to optimize that fabric having built it?
Right, okay. I'm going to drop off a copy of this one. If anybody has any questions before we jump forward, man in front. Start your question. Yeah.
I have a question regarding CSV. You mentioned that you are building, you are planning to have just one big CSV. You have several Hyper-V servers. Isn't this crowding out the CSV network?
No, because one of the things that we've done, and essentially when we started this thing off, we were using 1 gig Ethernet cards and effectively teaming them together. But as part of our re-engineering or reweaving of that network, we put in 10 gig Ethernets, and we've been able to team them. So essentially, drowning out that network is certainly not a problem that we're seeing at all. And the requirement for 10 gig will really depend on the fact of how much data and stuff you're pushing across that network. Because essentially, even in the previous versions of 1 gig, you did have that ability to spread that load across a number of 1 gig cards, one on each server. So it may be that you still have enough resources sitting in there, because even in CSV2, you still are going to send that communication across that 1 gig in each of those machines. So I certainly, if it's working today in CSV1, it's going to work for you in CSV2. And then if you need additional capacity, it becomes much easier to add that 10 gig. Great question. Thank you. And of course, don't forget the score at the end. Thank you, Ken.
So let's kind of look at optimizing clouds, and Damien, and kind of look at what you did to really drive efficiency across the clouds and fabric you created.
Right, okay, so we spent all our time fixing out that fabric, and it's really important as infrastructure guys to make sure we get that right, but we now need to move into that next level, figuring out those beautiful keywords of optimizing, controlling, standardizing, and right-sizing. Essentially, we're delivering what the NIST standard is on what cloud computing is all about. So using VMM and the infrastructure that we have there, we need to take a look at what we've done. You've seen already my libraries, they need a little bit of love. And what other areas that we need to go to do some optimizations on?
So looking at the right-sizing piece, it looks like you're using dynamic optimization. But I'm looking at the screenshot you've got there, and you're using medium. Can you give us a bit of a rationale around that?
Okay, so dynamic optimization, as a very quickly recap, essentially tells Virtual Machine Manager, keep an eye on what's happening on my Hyper-V hosts. So we've seen what placement does for previous loads. If you place a single virtual machine at a time, Virtual Machine Manager will try and figure out which host has got the least load, and he'll put the VM on that. Now, if you happen to be pushing out 5 or 6 VMs, he basically still asks the same question, and he pushes all 5 or 6 VMs onto that same host, overloading it. Bit of a problem. And this happens definitely when we've got users trying to push out new clouds. So dynamic optimization's job is for VMM to come back and say, oh, did I just make a mess of this damn system? And essentially then figure out that, yeah, I've got 4 VMs too many on that host, and I'll start moving them using live migration. The aggressiveness that you're looking at on a screenshot, essentially I turned, like any good IT pro, I turned it up to the top. Let's make this thing rumble. Not really a cool idea in all due respects, because what was happening is when I started looking at the environment, I got virtual machines popping over here and popping over there, and every flipping 4 or 5 minutes there's VM live migrating. And that started using up a load more resources, so NIOPS and stuff, as we started transferring memory and disk and stuff between the hosts. And I'm kind of thinking, okay, this is backwards. It's not supposed to happen. So I needed to figure out what was happening. And it was quite simply, I've got cloud users. So a guy logs into a virtual machine, he starts doing something on it, the load effectively goes up while he's working on it, and it might be something very short and simple. So immediately VMM sees this thing and says, oh crap, he needs more power. Let me move him over here out of the way. In the meantime, he finishes his job. He walks away and he leaves that machine in the cloud and he starts working on a different machine. VMM kicks in again. Oh, I'll move that machine over the other way. And this life cycle continues over and over. So it didn't take too long to figure out, turn down the damn sensitivity a little bit and try again. And you get that balance of saying, it's okay, these guys are actually going to do a little bit of work for maybe 2 or 3 minutes, don't panic. If he's doing it for 5 or 10 minutes, panic, move it then. So fine-tuning essentially is a good idea, and maybe turning it up to full volume at the start wasn't the most intelligent thing I ever done. There's a bug in that screenshot though. Can anybody see the mistake that's in that screenshot? Copy the book for anybody that's sharp.
Give them a hint.
I might give them a hint. There's something grayed out that shouldn't be grayed out, and in that grey out there should be a tick box. Anybody? Okay, we've got a fella in the corner over there. So what I didn't do is I didn't turn on the functionality to actually live migrate the virtual machines. So even if I have, as in the screenshot suggests, I have the system turned on to actually check and see, congratulations, to check and see if I should move stuff around, I didn't actually enable it. So even though VMM is doing its job in saying that there is too much load in one host, with that checkbox turned off, VMM won't actually fix the problem.
So that's kind of the optimizing for kind of utilization. But what about power management, Damien? Do you leverage that? Do you shut down and consolidate workloads during sort of out of peak hours?
Nigel, I live in Europe. You've seen the map. The data centers are sitting in Boston. So what if I burn the ozone over Boston? I don't have to deal with that. Sorry. I've got people that work in Boston. Then I apologize, gentlemen. No, in honesty, we are green. Of course, we're green. But if I think about what we're doing localization, as I showed, for a lot of different customers around the planet. So essentially, my cloud is running 24/7. So we turned this on for a short while. It never really kicked in. It might power it off a machine for 15 minutes, bring it back up. So the length of time that it was down was just introducing more problems for us. So we just turned it back off again. There wasn't a requirement to leave it on.
Mm-hmm. So let's look at the capacity planning and your forecasting around load.
Right, okay. So this is back again to that whole idea of these guys are coming in with new projects. They need a certain set of resources to do their work. And previously they had this requirement to justify it to finance. So the finance guys were always, it's my money and you ain't getting it. Now they're dealing with IT. Attitude is slightly different. It's kind of, you're IT, give me the damn thing. So we've got to basically turn on some sort of a capacity management system to make sure they don't take everything, because one of the problems that we have with the fact that we're not doing a show back is that, well, it's not costing me anything. I'm not telling you how much it's costing, how much resources you're using, and what I see is all I see. The fact that we have the rest of the organization all sitting up on that cloud, that's irrelevant. My project is all that matters. So we have to protect what we have in our physical infrastructure from the users that are using it in the virtual, and putting some sort of a capacity management on top of that is the only way to make that happen.
So do you see users asking for, certainly if I'm an end user, there's an option of the best environment or a slightly not high performing environment? What am I going to choose? I'm going to choose the best one. So how do you educate users to choose the resources that are most appropriate?
Quite simply, we don't tell them. It's as simple as we're not giving a distinction between gold or silver or bronze type performances, because they always need the gold. My project is more important, it's got tighter deadlines, I have to have faster systems. We don't offer that choice, and we take that back as a business decision and figure out that the stuff that's probably singly most important is that stuff that's hit the public market. It's those websites and stuff, or our business services. They are generally the ones that essentially need that gold stuff. So as IT professionals, we make that decision.
Okay.
Okay, so the other piece of this is a little bit of a gripe. Not that I ever complained, but we have a few challenges. If you've used the clouds, the tenants, and the challenges that they are introducing when you're using VMM, you have this ability essentially to carve up this environment into lovely little clouds, get our users in and make everything good and rosy in the garden. However, if you start thinking about this a little bit, and I'm going to give a very simple analogy, we have a DevOps team, and that DevOps team happens to be working on multiple different projects. Now within that project, they're kind of coordinating between each other. So I have a DevOps group who are responsible for application 1, but they're also cooperating with the team that are working on application 2. In the VMM world, that's pretty cool. I can build 2 separate clouds, and I essentially can give permissions essentially to that cloud, to team 1 and team 2. The problem is that these definitions are delivered not specifically as tenancies, but as roles. So one of the things that we get is when we start turning on that user interface is essentially we're delivering a single cloud per role. And when the user tries to log in, he's effectively made make a decision. So when we look at what would be something like an app controller interface, the first thing he's asked is, which role are you going to be working in? Are you going to be in Team 2's role, so you can see this one, or Team 1's role? And it kind of defeats the whole purpose of having a cloud and just logging in and basically seeing all the clouds, clicking on the cloud that I want to work on and work away. Now, I can deliver that option, no problem, by putting them all into one role, so don't ask them that question. But then I'm a bigger problem, because if I do that, then essentially I'm also giving you the permissions that are effectively exactly the same across all clouds. So even though you own the project that is project 1, that means you push out the virtual machines, delete the virtual machines and reset them. Because I've not segregated you to different role, you have that same permission for the other team's project. So they're ahead of you when you decide, I'm going to slow you down, I'm going to delete your VM. I can. And that means that we have a bit of a problem that we need to deal with. So as we move forward, one of our biggest gripes is that we need that permissions, or our actions control, as is known as in VMM, to be moved up as far as the tenancy, where today we can do things like quota, but we can't control the actions. So we've got to fix those. So that would certainly be one of the big gripes.
And you're using App Controller to allow your users to get access to their virtual machines and services?
Yeah, we are. We love App Controller. App Controller is one of those things that has effectively replaced the portal that came with 2008 and 2012. So if you've moved to SP1, you'll know the portal is gone. It doesn't exist in the box and you're not getting it back. App Controller we've looked at, we've used, and we've had fun with it. And it's pretty cool. It does what it says on the tin until you put a user in front of it and then ask a user to use it. And they will just sit and stare at the screen and try and figure out, what next? What am I supposed to do here? And when they finally figure out what they're supposed to do to create a new virtual machine, they'll start going through the little pop-up wizards to actually fill in the information, and then they'll start running into issues again, because you need additional information, and the boxes have a little red asterisk hidden in the corner saying, by the way, you need to click on me to give more information. The user doesn't see it. He's there scratching his head again, trying to figure out, oh, this is mad, lads. Seriously, you've got to fix this. So there's a user training required here for App Controller. So what looks like a simple task is extremely complicated and has a very poor experience for a user in comparison to what they had previously when they ran with a simple web portal that didn't do an awful lot, but what it done it well. So we certainly need to fix that.
So you're looking at moving to Windows Azure services for Windows Server, aren't you?
Absolutely. The Catal interface, as it was originally codenamed, is that same user interface you see on Windows Azure today. I can bring that back in-house now, download it free off the internet, and start that process of figuring out getting it to plug into VMM instead of the app controller, or run both in parallel. The experience that you put the user through in this one is absolutely day and night in comparison. It's a dream to utilize, and it's certainly where we're going to go. So App Controller is going to disappear just as quick as it appeared.
So let's kind of finalize this section by looking at kind of the reporting side of things and how you do analytics on what you have.
Okay, well, this is another area that essentially needs to get a little bit of love and attention from, and will over time. In this particular case, we are utilizing a simple KPI type scenario, gathering information from the environment using very simple PowerShell scripts to go out, figure out what the utilizations are for the key metrics, our disk, our memory, and our CPU, getting a count of how many particular virtual machines are running on that particular part of the fabric, and trending that into a database so we can start figuring out, am I going to have to get more resources, or do I have information to tell me that the particular project is going to be scaling out over the next few weeks, or is there a heads up that the new project's moving in? So we're utilizing our, I suppose, experiences over the last 3 or 4 years and the tooling that we needed to do. It's not really the way we need to be going, and even today with System Center 2012 and SP1, there are far better solutions sitting in the box. So for us, one of our actions to get into place is to start turning on that integration with SCOM and lighting up some of the reports that are sitting in there that can give us an awful lot more detail and a lot better drill down than what we're currently using. So this is certainly an investment area that's going to have to be addressed in our operation. So
we're going to transition to another topic shortly, but let's just reflect on what you've discovered in that optimizing phase of your project.
Right, well, okay, so I think very quickly to recap on that one, dynamic optimization is cool. Don't turn it on to full value, turn it down, play with it. We also have things like host reserves that are sitting on those servers to figure out how well the main host operating system is. Turn those off. and then slowly turn them on one at a time and figure out what you need on your host to reserve, to figure out how many VMs can I effectively fit onto that thing without actually overloading your host. So start small instead of starting high. It doesn't work the way you might just plan it to. Capacity over provisioning is cool, and it's something we all do, and that's the whole purpose of having an elastic cloud. But if you don't have the data to stand by what your previous history has been and what your future predictive history might be, you could be overzealous and you can give a whole lot more resources out there than you have available ultimately, and you might just get caught. So just be careful about that stuff. It's very easy to build lots and lots of clouds, give lots of resources out to the users, and then before you know it, these guys aren't shutting down VMs and you have no more resources left. Then you've got a house cleaning task to try and address. And from the self-service perspective, App Controller is the de facto standard right now for using self-service with SP1. Make sure that if you are going to deploy that thing, that you very, very seriously think about the training that is requirement to get our users up to speed on that. The user experience using App Controller is not just as simple and as fluid as you experience, and that challenge gives a bad taste for people trying to use your cloud solutions. Also, take a look at that Azure Services for Windows Server. That's freely available on the internet. It will plug in and run side by side with the App Controller solution. It is absolutely gorgeous, and the initial user experiences on it have been really, really positive. That's certainly something that you need to spend some time looking at.
Okay, let's look at IT as a service, or how LineBridge provides IT as a service.
So, I think everybody offers IT as a service because that's ultimately what we are. We are a service delivery platform. You deliver Exchange, you deliver SharePoint, you deliver different types of line of business solutions. And in this case, we've just focused on delivering things like a cloud as a service. But there's lots of other services that you essentially do and have the ability to deploy. So if we think for a few moments, some of the ones that we've looked at over the last 12 months is things like anti-malware, automation, ID management, and even mapping data and translating data into different types of formats. So from an anti-malware perspective, everybody has some sort of an anti-malware solution out there from a yellow box vendor. And every year or 2 years, you're going to have to go through that process of actually building up a brand new infrastructure and deploying that stuff out. There's a fair amount of work needed when you've got to hit a few thousand desktops to get this right and get the infrastructure in place. So one of the things that we took a look at was the fact that Microsoft's anti-malware solution is actually pretty good, and it's included in your enterprise licenses. And the effort to deploy it isn't any different from the effort required to push out any of the yellow box solutions. The benefit on the far side is that this is configuration manager. What you're building essentially is a configuration manager environment. You're building the infrastructure just to deliver this one service, and when you're done, like any yellow box solution, you're done. Except when you've done configuration manager, you're only beginning, because there's just so much more that's sitting in there that you can get your rest of your teams on. So a very, very simple deployment process, quite comparable to any other yellow box vendor solution, but the pros that you get at the end of that cycle is just the start of a massive infrastructure deployment that you can start really leveraging upon. The next one that we took a look at is the whole idea of that we've got tasks. You've got that scheduler. You've got that one machine sitting in your data center that's got a pile of different scheduled tasks that run through every night, and it might be cleaning up a disk, or it might be sending emails to remind users that the passwords are about to expire. And of course, you change a password on your service account or a user account because that happens to be the one that you're using for running your services on, and then nothing works. Orchestrator is one of those tools which really makes our life completely different. We don't need to worry about the fact of it's only running on one server. We can take our runbooks and we can graphically distribute those. We can put runbook servers into multiple locations, and a little bit like what we've done here under the screen, you can have all of the runbooks in one group, or you can separate them. And that kind of goes back to the whole idea of a stretched VLAN, trying to figure out which domain controller or which runbook server should I hit, or you can basically do them into two separate groups and actually synchronize the stuff. Now, Orchestrator is class, but it does have its limitations, and one of those is a little bit like what we've illustrated on the screen here, in that the runbooks that you publish in the first data center, if you've got a separate runbook environment in the second data center, they don't get there. So you got to go and push a second time, and you got to put them into standby mode. So this is where the community really becomes something valuable, because there are integration packs or extensions for Orchestrator which will allow you to actually say, these are the runbooks on my runbook server that I actually want to replicate over to the far side, and I can even monitor my runbook server with a runbook and figure out that, oh, I'm not running, I'm going to start up on the far side, or vice versa. The far side can be monitoring the master and figure out, oh, he's dead, my turn. So this infrastructure allows us then to ensure that we have much better control. We can do reporting into SQL and all of these things with just the drawing of a Visio icon. So extensibility is really where this one comes into. And the community has been really, really active. So Microsoft haven't really lived up to delivering us all the integration packs we need. We need to basically be able to talk to lots and lots of different things in our environment. And the beauty of Orchestrator is nearly defeated from the fact that we don't have enough of those integration packs. So using the community, we can certainly go up there, grab that stuff and use the Orchestrator integration toolkit, write a little bit of code, and essentially start delivering what is a managed code solution back into the Orchestrator environment.
So, Damien, does that mean our average IT pro has to go write code?
Yeah, so you need to go to TechEd and start learning C#. No, seriously, we definitely do not. We can take this and we can give this to a dev guy and let him go do this thing. Or we can go a step further, and within that toolkit, which is free to download, there's another little utility called the command line activity utility. Now this one's actually really smart. It allows us to go ahead and build that DLL that essentially is what the dev guys are going to go away with all that lovely managed code. And instead, we can draw what are the names of the activities we want to actually present, so the little icon is going to show up in Orchestrator, and put some code behind it. The code is PowerShell. So if you've got a function in PowerShell to do a particular thing like delete a user, make a mailbox, whatever the case is, take that and then simply put it into that command line utility. So the sample I've put on the screen here is for grabbing what is the BitLocker code for unlocking a particular machine. It's one of those things the help desk keep getting a ping on saying, I've just had this BitLocker thing, what's the code? The help desk don't have permission, essentially, to gather that information, so write a little bit of PowerShell, put it into an activity, and then all of a sudden you can automate that whole process through your help desk. So I've kept that code, actually, if you're interested, in the back of the deck, so it's a little bit of an Easter egg. You're more than welcome to pull it and try and set up this as an example for yourselves. But essentially, once you've done that, you can highlight what is it, the information you want to pass into that code, and on the far end, what it is you're going to pull back out, which is, in this case, going to be the BitLocker key. It wraps it up and it's ready to go straight into your Orchestrator console. So you can go ahead and easily take some of the code that you have and put it into that graphical piece so that everybody else in your team can now just basically drop that BitLocker activity and you're doing your own help. And then if you're a good community citizen, you'll throw that up on Codeplex so the next guy doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. And that community is growing and growing with lots and lots of new stuff showing up there all of the time. So from that, there's a lot of different things that we actually need to do and we can do. I've used this for a number of our line of business solutions, and in this particular case, what was essentially a SaaS solution that needs to have multiple pieces of software synchronized with each other. You're not sure if it's worked or if there's a problem. With Orchestrator, I can see the flow, I can show it to the dev guys or to the support team. This is exactly what we're doing. And I can grab a log and I can actually go as far as telling the guys to take Excel, point it directly at the Orchestrator server, and they will, in a pivot table on Excel, be able to find out the length of time it took to run a runbook, what activities stepped through, what activities failed, what activities passed, and I never have to get involved again. So he turned around and told me this thing didn't work over the weekend. He can check, he can do all of that stuff without any IT guy getting in the middle of the stuff. So this really, really is a massive step forward from what was the old scheduled task to being a very manageable solution that anybody can use. And then with activities like, for example, the green one is sitting in the middle, this is just one of the ones that I've put up on Codeplex for talking to a piece of software known as the Forefront Identity Management System and allowing us to start and stop runbooks. And again, you're more than welcome to go grab it and reuse it in your own flows. This is simply just an example of what we do for taking in files, putting it in to synchronize across some of our applications. And then, of course, the other side of that point is that to extend Orchestrator, you don't have to bother your heads if you don't want to with using the Orchestrator integration toolkits. You can take your PowerShell and spit it directly into an activity on the actual platform. And in this particular case, the sample that we're sharing is really using something as simple as a regex expression to take what might be a formatted report, that's got lots of columns that are physically printed down in the old ASCII formats, and essentially allowing us to take that into an object model, which we can then go and put into a database and then query and report. So this is one of those things where you've got something like SAP that just gives you the most ugly report in the world that nobody can ever work with. Take it, put it into an object model, stick it into a database, and then smile, because you don't have to ever look at it again. And those guys that do have to, it's their problem.
So, Damien, let's kind of review some of the key findings and experience for delivering IT as a service.
I think the first thing is to remember that you are a service. There's no question. You're already doing this. All you're doing is you're now adding more value. You are hiding into the back end. You're becoming less and less visible to the user, and you're delivering more and more services. You're putting those portals out in front of the user, and you're identifying what it is you can do. The real simple wins is certainly things like SCCM, which you'll think about being a really big project, but when you start looking around and realize that you have to deal with things like antivirus, which are massive projects, anyways touching everything, SCVMM is no extra work. It is very easy, and it actually has a really good job of actually kicking out the yellow box out of the way as well, making life easier. And the other side of the house is if you're not using anything else really in a System Center suite, Orchestrator is that very first simple thing to do. You're going to get lots of little wins. It's really easy to extend, and it's graphical, which means it's easy to communicate and explain to people, and it's highly available out of the box. So it's really one of those things that everybody should be playing with. And the community is brilliant, and you've got guys like Ryan Onoffer out there writing those really intelligent scripts that allows us to pull out runbooks and synchronize them up on other servers and stuff like that, filling in the gaps which Microsoft have been a little bit laxy on.
So it's pretty interesting so far, Damien, but what about the future? Where are you going with this solution?
Oh, I'm resigning. I'm done. No, in all respects. So it's a never-ending cycle here. But there's a few things you've seen as we've gone through the decks. There's some stuff that are very obvious that need to get some love and attention. Private clouds, for example, we need show back. We've got to start telling the users that if I ever was to start charging your Visa cards, this is what it would be costing. So please start turning off your resources. We need to get more information on predictivity for what these guys are going to use so that we can actually figure out what we need to be purchasing, and we are getting rid of that app controller and replacing it with the Windows Azure services for Windows Server. That I cannot stress enough is one of those things everybody needs to take a look at. If you are using app controller, this is where you're going to, and it is really cool. And then with the rest of the System Center suite, there's 2 or 3 big things that we have as objectives over the next year or so to deal with, and that is effectively the CMDB itself, and getting things like service management in place, and addressing full life cycles of our assets within the environment, and utilizing what we have in the cloud and what we have in physical, and getting that asset management into place. So pretty interesting projects ahead for sure. So to recap, essentially, what's left for us and what are the key lessons that we've come out of it? There's a number of different ones, but really organize yourself, understand what it is you're doing, and spend time planning that thing. Go back to that mind map, figure out what it is you're doing, make sure everybody's on the same page as yourself, and have a roadmap of where you're going to do. As I said, with things like converged networks, you don't have to do it today. Do it tomorrow. Plan for it now and understand how you're going. Make sure your team are with you. And that way, then you can start delivering milestones and making the rest of your management team appreciate the fact that I'm not sitting here with my head down doing nothing, because we know we're not, but they don't. So take things, deliver them up and say, milestone 1 is delivered, we're going for a party tonight and you're paying, mate. The next thing is about communications. Think that people understand what you're doing because this looks easy. No way. Certainly if you look at things like App Controller, which is probably one of my biggest learnings this year, you sit behind it, you think this is really cool, it's really easy to use, then you hand it out to a user and watch them get lost in what is a really simple process. These things are not as obvious as they need to be. So if you can't see your users because they're all across the planet, use Camtasia or whatever it may be. Record some screen sessions and stuff. If they don't watch it, then at least when they come complaining to your help desk, you can point them back and say, now go watch it, and have them just figure out how to help themselves. It's all about self-service at the end of the day, and I'm not their service hand holder. Essentially, we're giving them the information they need. Let's encourage them to figure out why they need it and how to use that. And communicate. Send out monthly mails or whatever it is saying, we've just done this. Don't be shocked on the fact that half of your organization has no idea that you even have a cloud service or you are running desktop management or all of these different things. Send out mails saying we can do these. Give very simple scenarios of what works, what doesn't work. Show some of your run books and stuff. You'd be surprised how many people have different ideas and you're kind of thinking, blimey, that's a great idea, and you can take that over and then re-communicate that stuff. And once you get your users involved in this stuff, IT as a service becomes easier and easier and easier because you are now providing a service that the users actually really want to get. And clouds, well, we know how confusing clouds can be. We're IT pros and we've got our head around it at this point. Our users still don't get it. Make onboarding to that cloud process simple so that they do get it. They're still afraid of the fact that I'm taking away the resources from them. Make it really easy and use things like the Windows Server Azure services for Windows Server, and make it really easy for users to get there.
Okay. So what are the, just a few kind of things around your experience on the tab that you want to share with everyone?
If you're not on one, get on one. Because as simple as that is, when you start using Microsoft technology, it doesn't always do what you want it to do. So find the Nigels of the world and harass them and tell them what it is you're trying to do. You all have business solutions and scenarios that you need to deal with. They don't work the way you want them to do. The Nigels of the world are the people that get into the product groups and effectively allow you to influence what it is you're doing. The more scenarios, the better the scenarios and the deeper they are, the better chances you are of going to get a good engagement with these guys. So I think the key piece there is working directly with these people is fantastic. They have an investment in your success and you have an investment in your own success. So it's brilliant. And there's a whole lot of different methodologies around doing that. So if you're not part of TAP, that's certainly one of the strong recommendations. So I think we are pretty close to the end of this stuff. As we started at the start, myself and Nigel have been working on blogs for trying to explain that network virtualization stuff that's so easy to do in VMM 2012. So if you haven't been following us, I think we are pretty close to getting the next post out. It's extremely difficult to write this stuff because as we write it, we realize that who's going to read this? Nobody unless you're a Martian. So we've been working hard to try and make this thing into easier pieces of digestible content.
And yeah, the sequence, we actually kind of committed to writing these things a little more frequently, but it's just we're putting so much content, it's taking a little longer. So be patient, the stuff is coming. So we've probably run out of time, but I want to give you guys an opportunity for questions. So anybody questions? We've got 3 books left, so the first 3 will get a book. So let's go and get those questions.
Grab a microphone there beside you, and let's see, can we answer your questions? Okay.
What is the best way then to do a task if you have something run where you're taking pieces of
Right, so let me recap that. If I have a run book in 2 different run book servers dealing with 2 different clouds, and I want to coordinate the 2 run book servers as I'm working on 2 different clouds. Right, that doesn't work. So as you know already, Microsoft does not allow you to control a run book server from a run book. So this is where our friend Ryan Anhofer and the community come into play. And there is an integration pack sitting up on Codeplex that you can download, which allows you to actually control another runbook server and also export and import runbooks. So you could go ahead, design the runbooks just as you require them, and then using his activity, you can actually target that to say, right, I've got to a point in my activity on my first runbook server, now go trigger the flow on the second runbook server, and then you can put an activity in there saying, right, I'm done here, you go back and start going again. So Ryan Anhofer is your friend in this case. Codeplex is where you need to go to, and he's got the answer for you. It's fantastic. And congratulations, I'm going to give you a copy of Hyper-V installation and configuration. Enjoy the read. Thank you. Great question.